Welcome to AJP Audio for September 2025. I'm Aaron Van Dorn. Today on the podcast, I spoke with Dr. Deidre Anglin from the City College of the City University of New York. Dr. Anglin and colleagues have a study in the September issue of the journal looking at the disparate impact of schizophrenia spectrum disorder diagnosis on racial and ethnic minorities in the United States based on local neighborhood data. Afterwards, AJP Editor-in-Chief Dr. Ned Kalin joins us once again to discuss that and the rest of the September issue of the journal. Dr. Anglin, previous research has found that minoritized individuals in the United States, especially Black individuals, have higher rates of diagnosis of schizophrenia spectrum disorders than non-Hispanic white individuals. But questions still remain as to issues of diagnosis rates and the role of environment in these disparities. Your study aimed to look at the prevalence of SSD in the U.S. and the role of social neighborhood inequalities. What did you find?
We looked in a very rigorous sample, the Mental and Substance Use Disorders Prevalence Study, MDPS, which is a national sample of the United States. It's a household probability sample, almost a little under 5,000 households, participants in the sample. And so what we did was we looked at this and we wanted to understand whether or not we saw a racial disparity in schizophrenia spectrum disorders as well as psychotic symptoms. And what we found first was that Black individuals had a higher probability of having schizophrenia spectrum disorders and psychotic symptoms than white individuals. And also, multiracial individuals had a higher probability of having schizophrenia spectrum disorders than white individuals. This has been something that has been shown in previous studies, meta-analyses that I've been a part of as well. But this sample was not a clinical sample where there are lots of confounding variables, right, in terms of differential access. This was also a sample that was rigorously assessed with a diagnostic instrument. It wasn't just a mental health record that you got from the chart. Also, the mental health clinicians who did the assessments were trained specifically in culturally responsive assessment of, psychiatric disorders, period, but specifically also schizophrenia. So there are a lot of things about this sample, the MDPS, that really made it an ideal space to really look at this question and address some of the limitations of previous studies. And so we found that racial difference, but we wanted to really see, because I've hypothesized this in previous work, like factors in the environment connected to structural racism are likely involved in this disparity. Not to say that other factors aren't, but like where people live, the air they breathe, where they tend to the kids go to school, like these kinds of things affect you every day. So we looked at the social vulnerability metric, which is a fairly new, very comprehensive assessment of different zip code level factors in the environment. Not just what's the income, percentage of people below poverty, but even things like what's the percentage of, vacant households, vacant units in the neighborhood. Things like education or, things related to how many civilian veterans have a disability in the neighborhood. So it was very much capturing the multidimensional aspects of social determinants of health in a composite index. And when we actually controlled for that, we saw that the disparity between Black and white individuals in schizophrenia spectrum disorders was significantly attenuated and not significant anymore. And we saw the same thing for psychotic symptoms. So there was something about the fact that Black individuals were more likely to live in higher socially vulnerable neighborhoods, neighborhoods with higher social vulnerability, that really was related to why they had this sort of elevated prevalence compared to white individuals. We didn't see that for the multiracial difference. It wasn't completely attenuated in that way. It was still a significant disparity, which means there's more to learn.
Is there an average population size for the zip code area neighborhoods that you're looking at? Are they consistently similar sizes, or do they vary by?
They vary by zip code in reality. And so, but one thing to note is that it captured rural areas, suburban areas, urban areas across the United States. And so that's one thing, like zip code can capture spatially different levels of space, right? But also different population densities. this social vulnerability metric is always divided by population size. Like it accounts for the population size in the zip code so that that's adjusted for.
A little bit of history here. Redlining was a practice where areas with higher concentrations of minoritized individuals were excluded from many financial goods and services, among other forms of structural racism, both licit and illicit. This was a very common practice, especially during the middle part of the 20th century up into the 70s and 80s. It has somewhat been attenuated since then, but I think remnants of it still obviously linger. But do you see a higher prevalence of schizophrenia, spectrum disorders in minoritized populations, especially Black individuals, as part of this legacy?
I do. I do see this as part of this legacy. And I see it as part of why we actually did find what we found, where once we controlled for that aspect of neighborhoods, we saw that the disparity was reduced significantly. And I think minoritized individuals, sort of immigrants, like, recent immigrants, there's a lot of different factors that are involved with regard to the social environment and what may contribute to stress. But for particularly Black individuals, Black Americans with a long legacy of structural racism in this country that has been often done through neighborhoods, right? I think that that is connected to the kinds of stress, the kinds of socially vulnerable environments that Black folks may be more likely to live in because they were forced into it, right? Historically, into certain kinds of, resources were taken out. And even when Black communities, thinking of like Tulsa,
Mhm.
like once they started to actually create capital, they were destroyed historically. So that's not something that just rectifies in a year. And so I
Yeah.
think some of these kinds of historical factors connected to structural racism are very much connected to the kinds of disparities we see in health in other areas, but also for schizophrenia spectrum disorders.
As you were saying, there's a clear link between red line neighborhoods and elevated levels of COPD, asthma, cardiovascular disease, and other chronic health conditions that have been seen in Black individuals in these neighborhoods going back for decades. And Black neighborhoods in the United States have historically often had greater proximity to highways, exposure to pollutants, and industrial areas than other neighborhoods, among other factors. It's clear to see how exposure to pollutants and highways and things like that can contribute to chronic health conditions like cardiovascular disease and COPD. But what did your study find about the conditions of what you termed the socially vulnerable neighborhoods that you looked at that might have contributed to elevated levels of schizophrenia spectrum disorder that you found?
Right. And so what the study found was the social vulnerability, which the way it's measured is as a composite index. So it's not like you take one part out here or take one part there. It was really meant to capture a comprehensive understanding of how a neighborhood could be vulnerable.
Sure.
So everything from physical infrastructure to the kinds of employment opportunities people have to education, to, like I said before, how many houses are vacant in a particular neighborhood, which are signs of neglect. So I think some of these, there's like 24 variables in this index,
Hmm.
and some of them are very much related to exposure to environmental toxins, like you're speaking about air pollutants. And there's an increasing body of research suggesting that air pollution is very much related to mental health outcomes, including psychosis. But that's an early kind of area that I think we need to look at even further in terms of thinking about this disparity and what you're saying about redlining and, where, especially with urban renewal, even,
Hmm.
there's just like a lot of potential pollutants in the air where folks are, particularly Black folks, even thinking about gentrification. I mean, you could really see how this could be related to several factors, but I think more attention needs to focus on what are the kinds of elements of social environments that might be particularly relevant for schizophrenia. And that's some of the research that I'm looking at now, trying to identify latent subgroups of neighborhood indicators that are inclusive of things like noise, air pollution, as well as other social vulnerabilities captured in the social vulnerability metric for this present paper here.
Structural racism and broader questions of inequality obviously require solutions that go far beyond what individuals can offer. But what can clinicians take from your study when working with individuals from these populations?
Yeah, I think, I get this question a lot in terms of like, look, I'm just one clinician. I can't just end racism, right? It's like, well, no one's expecting you to do that. And we're not moving people out of their neighborhood either, right? Because, I just want to emphasize that because there are also protective factors in some of these high ethnic density neighborhoods, for example, that we don't want to lose, that we want to accentuate. But we should at least be inquiring about people's experiences in where they live, and in terms of what exposures that they have and what are some ways we can connect patients we may work with enriched programs,
Mm-hmm.
right? How do we get more involved in the community? Can you do more community group work where people can talk about their community conditions and help support that in ways? And it's not to say that you're going to necessarily be on the front line, with picket signs, but like I think there are ways we can be more inclusive of the ways social environments that people experience day to day impact their stress, impact their symptoms, impact the exacerbation of their symptoms. But I also think clinicians who work with children can really play a key role as well, because you can sort of help minimize the stress and identify the factors and the triggers in the environment that you can help them work through before it becomes exacerbated, right? And so I think that's another place where we can intervene more early, or school-based programs can do more things, clinicians that work in those kind of settings where it's more generalized, where we help youth in these socially vulnerable neighborhoods navigate
Mm-hmm.
some of these things. And of course I'm always advocating for like more upstream interventions, but I understand your point, like as a clinician who may not be doing that, what are some things you can do? And I think that's just just a few things that we could add or implement or add to our toolkit, if you will, in terms of what we inquire about in our patients, what we ask about, and knowing that the social environment and where folks live holds so much of potential stress risk for mental health challenges and including psychosis.
It's possible to look at mental health issues, especially things like schizophrenia, and concentrate too much on the genetic aspects of it and to ignore the broader aspects of ambient culture and ambient stressors that exist in the environment.
Yes, yes. I mean, clearly there's genetic factors and biological factors. Like not everybody in these environments gets schizophrenia, right?
Sure.
Otherwise, the prevalence would be, out
Yeah.
of, sort of out through the roof. So I think though that we've spent a lot of time trying to identify like very specific genetic factors or biomarkers. And I don't know that we've made as much traction there as we would have liked. But I think if we incorporate more work on that social environment and what matters for folks who might have genetic risk, because
Mm-hmm.
not everybody with genetic risk goes on to have schizophrenia, right? And so, how can we have much more inclusive models of research that look at these factors and include social determinant factors in the model and try to understand how we can improve prediction and maybe individualized treatment better?
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's an important element that I hope that this paper highlights. If we're trying to really decrease that elevated potential risk in vulnerable populations.
What were the limitations of your research?
Oh, there were so many. No.
That's true
I mean,
for
I
all
think,
research, but
right, all research has so many limitations, right? And I'm so upfront about it because I know that this is like one study and we have to do so many more.
mm-hmm.
But one of the big limitations, in trying to understand racial differences in the prevalence of a low prevalence disorder
Mm-hmm.
in the general population is that you need a lot of people. And we don't have those national registries that they have, like in Sweden, for example. And so this was collected from 2020 to 2022, the data. And so it overlapped with the pandemic.
Additional stressors.
Yeah, exactly. But that limited the ability to do in person interviews, like
Mm-hmm.
in the household, which also limited lowered the response rate a bit, right? So that's one of the limitations. We don't have as much people as I think we would have wanted to look at schizophrenia in this way. Sort of the strength is that these folks have all had a SCID interview, which
Mm-hmm.
is, much better than just like an electronic health record. But the drawback of that is that it's a smaller number of people. And so that's one of the limitations. I think also you could argue that zip code, while it's great to have this sort of objective indicator of like a area, it varies across the United States. How many people or what's captured in that zip code. So if we had, addresses or even like smaller census tract, we might get a level of specificity that would reveal even more. And then we didn't look at it in conjunction with other self-reported factors like racial discrimination, right? Maybe if we adjusted for that, we would see the multiracial white difference have attenuated to non-significance, possibly, right? I think there's many things that we could do in future research to improve our understanding of these phenomena.
You touched on this a little bit earlier, but what's next for your research?
Well, I'm really actually working with folks in biology to look in a large database, very, very large, where there are thousands of people with schizophrenia. But again, it's not an epidemiologic sample, but really looking at genetic factors, epigenetic type of factors, and its relationship to social determinants, and how that looks in various groups, racial self-identified groups across the United States. And so that's kind of where I'm kind of moving a bit to really trying to see, well, how do these things connect? These social determinants, because I'm not an interventionist, so to speak, as a researcher. I'm really always just trying to understand how these things are connected. And so that's where I'm looking now at and really also understanding the protective factors a bit better in these neighborhoods that might have a lot of minoritized individuals. I've published research that looks at the ethnic density of neighborhoods and how there's actually some real protective factors in there that predict whether folks will be in remission. People who are at clinical high risk for psychosis, whether they go into remission. If during childhood they were kind of not isolated culturally around a lot of other folks, children that also hold minoritized identities, later on, prospectively, they were more likely to go into remission as opposed to stay symptomatic. And so I'm also looking into more, what are some of the protective factors that we don't want to lose? We want to maybe enrich in these neighborhoods that may have some social vulnerabilities, but like what are some of the other protective and factors that are or might be helpful in reducing stress, improving cohesion, support, community support. So that's some of the research that I'm really looking to continue.
Well, Dr. Anglin, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Up next, Dr. Ned Kalin. Dr. Kalin, welcome back to AJP Audio for September 2025.
Thank you, Aaron. It's a pleasure to be with you.
First up, from earlier in this episode, I spoke with Dr. Anglin about the impact of neighborhood social vulnerability and racial disparities in schizophrenia spectrum disorder prevalence. What can you add?
Aaron, this is a really important study with findings that I think have widespread implications for how we think about clinical practice and also how we approach patients and get histories. And it really gets at the issue related to environments that people grow up in relation to the increased risk that they have to develop schizophrenia spectrum disorders and schizophrenia itself. The study is a study that was done by Anglin et al. It used roughly 4,700 individuals that were studied from 2020 to 2022, and all these individuals participated in a national representative health survey looking at mental health and substance abuse prevalence. What the individuals did was that they looked at the prevalence, the past year, and the lifetime history of schizophrenia spectrum disorders, and also positive symptoms of schizophrenia, using structured clinical interviews done by trained clinicians who are at least clinically trained individuals who are also trained to be sensitive to cultural and racial biases that can influence psychiatric diagnoses. One of the major focuses of this work was to not only look at the prevalence of these disorders, but to also focus on racial differences and neighborhood vulnerabilities in relation to the incidence of the diagnosis of these illnesses. So in this relatively large sample of 4,700 individuals, in addition to looking at diagnoses, the researchers gauged vulnerability scores for the neighborhood in which individuals grew up and lived in. And these are called neighborhood social vulnerability scores. And basically, this was done using information from zip codes, because we know that zip codes themselves are very much indicative of differences in the vulnerability that individuals have in the neighborhoods that they grow in. So this really gets at looking at the interactions between race, social determinants of health, such as the neighborhood vulnerability scale, and diagnoses. Now, in this large sample, about 114 individuals were determined by interviews by trained individuals to meet criteria for schizophrenia spectrum disorder. And 348 individuals had significant positive symptoms of schizophrenia without meeting the criteria for the diagnosis. And what the researchers found was that when they looked at racial issues, that there was a much greater likelihood of having a diagnosis if you were non-Hispanic Black or if you were non-Hispanic multiracial. In fact, the likelihood for non-Hispanic Blacks as compared to white individuals was 3.49 times greater. And for multiracial individuals, it was 4.59 times greater. So a dramatic increase in the likelihood of having these diagnoses if you came from these racial and ethnic backgrounds. This was also the case for positive symptoms. So there's roughly a twofold greater likelihood for these racial groups to be more likely to have positive symptoms than white individuals. Also, when they looked at the neighborhood vulnerability scores, there was an increased prevalence of schizophrenia spectrum disorder neighborhoods where there were higher vulnerability scores. And also, for example, non-Hispanic Black individuals on average had higher neighborhood vulnerability scores. So all of these things sort of went together. Now, what's really important about this study is when the investigators statistically controlled for the vulnerability scores of the neighborhoods, they found that the racial differences in the likelihood of having these diagnoses disappeared, which strongly suggests that this is not an issue related to race per se, but is an issue related to the environment in which one grows up and in which one lives. And that more deprived, more stressful environments are more likely to have individuals that will develop schizophrenia spectrum disorders or at least be diagnosed with it. And again, I want to emphasize that this is not due to a bias in the raters that actually did the ratings and the scoring here, because these were culturally sensitively trained individuals, but rather a real effect that is most likely driven by the neighborhood in which one lives and grows up in. So this really gets at, again, the importance of us in psychiatry addressing the social determinants of health, to taking them into account, and at a much more interventional level, again, working to combat the long-term effects of structural racism that have resulted in individuals living in environments and not having access to resources that create more stress and also more vulnerability for developing psychiatric illnesses, and in this specific case, schizophrenia spectrum disorders.
It's been established that in other realms of medicine, things like pollution, exposure to stress, that kind of thing can have deleterious health impacts in COPD, cardiovascular disease, that kind of thing. But when we're speaking of psychiatry, what can clinicians take from this for relatively low incident disorders such as schizophrenia spectrum disorder when they're looking at patients?
Well, these are, they're relatively low incidence disorders, although not that low. So it's, estimated that roughly 1% of the population is schizophrenia, which is still a high number. But when in a psychiatrist's office, that's what we do all day long, is we see, these patients. So I think what this really means is that we need to be very aware of not only the diagnosis that someone comes in with, but also, what are the factors that have contributed to that diagnosis? Because that gives us more insight into how we can help people over time. It also, I think, as you point out, these vulnerability factors are not specific to psychiatric patients or to psychiatric illnesses. These vulnerability factors influence medical illnesses across the board. And so these individuals that are living in these environments not only have greater risk for one illness, but have greater risk for numerous illnesses. And the comorbidity of these illnesses, both across psychiatric and medical areas, increases the stresses that individuals face. The complications of these illnesses are greater. They're harder to treat because of the comorbidity. And these individuals have less resources and more barriers to have treatment. So I think it really speaks to, as a psychiatrist, and this is my personal view, that not only should we be treating the patient in front of us and being sensitive to the issues that they face, but also we should be taking an advocacy stance for all the patients that we deal with, and especially those that have been minoritized and have greater vulnerabilities to develop the illnesses that we treat.
Next, we have a paper from Vano and colleagues. It's a mapping study using MRI and PET scans to quantify iron levels in brain structures associated with schizophrenia.
This is a really interesting study, and it also is involved with the same types of patients we just talked about, schizophrenia, but comes at it obviously from a very different angle. The first paper that we talked about was a socio-demographic study looking at factors that relate to differences in diagnosis and interacting with racial issues. This paper now gets down to a very biological level and asks questions about what in the brain may be related to developing schizophrenia or having schizophrenia. And more specifically, it looks at interactions between the dopamine system, which we know is overactive in patients with schizophrenia, and also an interesting idea that brain concentrations of iron may actually be related to some of the alterations that we see in dopamine. It's a pretty complicated study. It uses state-of-the-art brain imaging and it uses two types of imaging. One is MRI, and the other is positron emission tomography. The MRI is, again, state-of-the-art. It looks at various types of signals that allow us to detect, actually, and semi-quantitate iron concentrations in different brain regions. This is building on work that has used a method called neuromelanin MRI imaging. And we've talked about this before and have had papers in the journal about this. But neuromelanin is a pigment that is actually deposited in brain cells that contain dopamine. We know it's a proxy marker for dopamine turnover and dopamine function. Neuromelanin also binds iron. And some people have been concerned in the interpretation of the neuromelanin imaging that this could be influenced by iron. So this gets to be a sort of a complicated story, but I'll try to simplify it for us. What these investigators did was that they took patients and they did some fancy imaging looking at neuromelanin signaling. They also used a method that allows us to get more quantitative about brain levels of iron. This is called quantitative susceptibility mapping. And they also use yet another imaging measure that allows us to look at proxies for white matter. And the reason for that is because white matter is made up of myelin, and myelin can interact with all these other measures. So basically, the bottom line is they took these three sophisticated imaging measures, put them together, and came out with an understanding in the patients that they studied that it looks like in this sample of patients that there actually may be decreases in iron levels in brain regions where there are cell bodies for dopamine. They also found that what appeared to be these decreases in iron levels was correlated with increases in function of the dopamine system in the sites that the dopamine neurons project to, from the brainstem to the striatal regions, which we know is a pathway that's involved with schizophrenia. So long story short, the finding here is that it looks like there may be evidence to support the idea that there are lower concentrations of iron in regions that contain brain dopamine neurons, and that these lower concentrations of iron may actually be associated with increased brain dopamine activity in areas that are involved with some of the symptoms related to schizophrenia. Now, the authors try to draw some causal relationships and make the suggestion that maybe these lower iron levels actually are causing some of the brain dopamine alterations. That is not warranted at this point. There's not evidence to support that. This is an association between lower iron concentration and increases in turnover in dopamine in schizophrenia patients. So a really interesting study, really early. There's a really good editorial about this for those that are interested, led by Dr. Anissa Abidarm, who's an expert in brain imaging and schizophrenia, to sort of put this into context. But again, really interesting finding.
Following that and staying with biomarkers, but from a very different angle, there's a paper from Moussa-Tooks and colleagues using grip strength as a potential marker for early psychosis.
Yeah, this is an intriguing study as well. And I think one of the things that I find really interesting and exciting about this issue of the journal is that the papers are quite novel. And this is a paper that, believe it or not, looks at grip strength in relation to schizophrenia. And you could say, how in the world could grip strength be related to schizophrenia? Grip strength turns out to be a general marker of physical well-being and psychological well-being. And when you think about it, that sort of makes sense that, people that are not doing as well in either physical or psychological domains may not have the strength to actually grip something, but also grip strength turns out is a reflection of not just motor activity, but also psychomotor activity, that is motivational factors and a whole bunch of other things. Now, it's been known for a long time that grip strength is associated with well-being in individuals. And what this study did was to look at grip strength, various symptoms of psychosis, and well-being, as well as brain imaging, in individuals that had psychotic disorders early on in their illnesses within the first 5 years. And what they did is they looked at 70 individuals with psychotic histories or psychotic symptoms, and they compared this to 51 controls. And what they found is that individuals with psychosis had reduced grip strength. They also had decreases in well-being, which is not surprising. And across the whole sample, they found that there was a correlation between well-being measures and grip strength, which has been reported before. They also looked at brain imaging. They looked at resting functional connectivity, and they used a fairly complicated way of looking at this, but they found that they could develop individual patterns of functional connectivity that were associated with grip strength, and they could also develop patterns of functional connectivity that were associated with well-being. And they found, interestingly enough, that there were overlaps when they looked at the overlap in brain functional connectivity between grip strength and well-being. Now, not complete overlaps, but there were some functional connectivity patterns that actually overlap between the two, suggesting that there may be a neural substrate or a neural signature that is shared between grip strength, individual differences in grip strength, and individual differences in ratings of well-being. They also found some differences between individuals that had psychotic disorders and controls in their functional connectivity patterns. But this is not directly linked to the findings of grip strength or well-being, at least in my mind as I read the paper. So taken together, I think what we can surmise from this is that individuals with psychotic disorders, relatively new psychotic disorders, have reductions in grip strength, they have reductions in well-being, and that these two are correlated within these individuals. They also have patterns of brain activity that reflect or are related to grip strength and well-being with some overlap. Again, we can't really tie any causality between the brain data and the phenotypic data related to behavior, that is the grip strength data and the well-being data. But it is intriguing that we can now see some brain signatures with resting functional connectivity that are related to these measures. But most importantly, I think thinking about how we can begin to use grip strength as a measure in psychiatric patients to think about how it relates to outcomes, to symptoms, and perhaps to overall well-being and functional capacity of individuals.
Finally, we have a paper from Zhang and colleagues using cognition-guided neurofeedback to improve inhibition capability in men with methamphetamine use disorder.
So this is another really interesting study. We're sort of changing topics a bit here, and now moving from psychotic disorders to a substance use disorder, in this case, methamphetamine use disorder. And this is a study that was actually performed in China in a rehabilitation facility. And so I think that's important to keep in mind in the context of the findings, because when we get to the end here, one of the questions is how generalizable will these findings be? And it was done in relatively small samples. But what's interesting is what the investigators did is that they took individuals with methamphetamine substance use disorder who were in treatment and who were not taking any methamphetamine at the time and who were also in an institution. And they used EEG with multiple electrodes to understand how an individual's brain reacted to a cue that was associated in the past for that person with taking methamphetamine. So we know that cues related to drug use in people that have substance use disorders activate the brain and also activate craving. And one of the ideas about treatment is to think about how to help people deal with the urges and the cravings that occur when they see cues that were previously associated with their drug use. And with the idea being that if they can regulate their emotions and their motivations and their behavior during those times, that they'll be less likely to re-engage or reactivate behaviors that are associated with substance use disorders.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole idea here is that this has to do with what we call response inhibition, which is a psychological term for basically saying the ability to inhibit an impulse that you might have at the time to keep yourself from engaging in a behavior that could be deleterious to you. So what the study was basically on an individual basis, understanding how one's brain reacted to a cue that was associated with previous methamphetamine abuse, getting a pattern of brain activity that's related to that, and then having people do biofeedback to try to reduce the brain activity pattern that's specifically associated with the cue that activates their brain. Now, one of the really interesting things that they did here is that they did this on an individual basis. So one individual's brain may have a different pattern of brain activity when they see a cue than another's individual's brain, but they used the individual pattern that each had as a way to use as a biofeedback target to reduce that activity. This is a double-blind controlled design. It was done in all males who had methamphetamine use disorder. And what they did, they had two samples. In the first sample, they had 33 participants that received 10 sessions of this neurofeedback training that was focused on reducing their individualized brain pattern of activity that was associated with a presentation of a methamphetamine-related cue. And the response of these individuals was compared to another 33 participants, same diagnosis, underwent the same procedures, but in this case, the biofeedback was focused on reducing patterns of brain activity that were not related to a cue that was associated with their drug use. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
That was sort of the sham group. And as I mentioned before, all the participants were absent from the drug, and they were in this rehabilitation facility in China. And what they found is that the individuals that received the real neurofeedback, they learned actually to downregulate the EEG signature that was associated with methamphetamine-related cues. They also reported greater reductions in craving and had greater reductions in a sort of a task called a go-no-go task that actually measures their ability to inhibit themselves. This was compared to the group that received the sham treatment. Now, there was another smaller group that was a little bit different where the experiment was done and the findings were generally replicated. So this is really interesting. This suggests that if we can develop a method to look at an individualized pattern of brain activity that's related to one's drug use or what the cues that stimulate one's drug use, that we can then train an individual to reduce that brain activity. And at the same time, that appears to have an effect on reducing their craving for the drug and also sort of their psychological responses to the drug. That is a greater ability to inhibit their behaviors when presented with a cue. Now, one thing that's important to keep in mind is that this was not tested in the real world setting. Okay, these people, we don't know what happens to these people when they go out into their real environment, the real world, and how this all works. But this is sort of a proof of concept that we can begin to use neurofeedback with these types of individualized EEG patterns that may result actually in helping people better regulate their impulses when they are encountering a cue that in the past stimulated them to use a drug and to go on to have their substance use disorder. Really good editorial associated with this as well that talks about this in general and also talks about the idea of using not only EEG, but actually MRI signals as feedback mechanisms to help people deal with substance use problems.
Well, Dr. Kalin, thank you once again for joining us.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure, Aaron.
That's all for this month's AJP Audio. Be sure to check out the other podcasts on offer from the APA, including Psychiatric Services from Pages to Practice. In the most recent episode, Dr. Lisa Dixon and Dr. Josh Bearson talked to Dr. Bob Drake about a personal reflection he wrote on mental health, employment, and individual placement and support. That and more can be found at psychiatryonline.org or wherever you get podcasts. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individual speakers only and do not necessarily represent the views of the American Psychiatric Association. The content of this podcast is provided for general information purposes only and does not offer medical or any other type of professional advice. If you're having a medical emergency, please contact your local emergency response number.